All right, let's get started on the second week of the module on European and North American art from the first half of the 20th century. And just as a reminder, I'm putting back up our overview and our module objectives that will carry us through this entire module. Remember, we're talking about a lot of different isms, a lot of different art movements, and so we want to trace the development of the avant-garde, and we want to understand how the avant-garde is responding to different political ideologies, different social and political upheavals. The first ism we're going to look at is Futurism, and Futurism is part of a group of a number of different movements who are all responding to Cubism and all thinking about different paths of abstraction. Of course, the other overarching historical and political context for this work is World War I and how artists reacted to it. A man named Marinetti was the founder of the Futurist movement. And I think his quote here at the bottom says a lot about what Futurism was interested in. He said, "A roaring car," and remember, a car is a new invention in the early 20th century. "A roaring car that seems to ride on shrapnel is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." And he is referring to here the Nike of Samothrace, that great Hellenistic sculpture that is on the grand staircase in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Marinetti and the other futurists embraced vitality, speed, urbanism, and modernity, so much so that they were anti-history in any sense. In fact, I think he'd be really mad that Futurism was being taught in an art history class. They were anti-museums, anti-art institutions. They scorned antiquity. They scorned femininity, anything that could be described as weakness or passivity. And the futurists actually become aligned with the Italian fascists. This is Mussolini's party that rises to power in Italy in the 20s, because they see Mussolini as an opportunity, this kind of new political regime that will cleanse Italy of its overburdened past and look only to the future. This might not be the work that you would initially think of with Futurism, but I think it shows us in a kind of more light-hearted manner what the futurists were interested in. We have this fantastic little dachshund here, this little wiener dog walking on a leash, tail flapping, the leash swinging, and we see a world in constant motion. This idea of how to convey speed, energy, action in a canvas. All of the futurists were really interested in advances in photography at the time, specifically stop-action photography, and they were fascinated by the ability of technology to extend the realm of visual perception, and they're trying to recapture that in their work as well. In Severini's Armored Train, here we see the kind of more militaristic side of Futurism, but we also have, I think here, this is maybe more clearly indebted to Cubism. This work was painted in 1915, the year Italy entered World War I, and it reflects a futurist declaration that was made the same year. The futurist said, "War is a motor for art." War is a motor for art. And Severini wanted so badly to enlist in the war, but he was not physically well enough. He didn't pass his physical exam, but he was obsessed by this first fully mechanized world war that introduced things like, here we see this armored train, machine guns, the first time we see chemical warfare. Some people might have been abhorred by it, but the futurists embraced it. Severini was actually living in Paris, and he witnessed the city's bombardment during the war. And he also lived next to a train station where he saw trains constantly transporting soldiers and weapons. And so we see that recreated here with the smoke from the gun and cannon fire that's obscuring the natural landscape. We see this militarized locomotive car and all of these the faceless uniform soldiers here firing in unison. Severini celebrates war here, and the futurists believe that war could generate a new Italian identity, one of military power and also artistic power. Boccioni had traveled also to Paris, which is the nexus of the avant-garde, and he visited Picasso in his studio. He was interested in showing multiple perspectives, as Picasso did in his work as well. And we see that in this form, this humanoid form with these shifting planes of scalloped forms. And we have this very kind of strong, powerful, aggressive figure. It's almost a fusion of the human body with the modern machine. And this celebration of energy and power for their own sake. Now, Boccioni is, like Franz Marc, another member of the avant-garde who enlisted in World War I. And he actually fell in action. He was killed as a soldier. And as I've mentioned before, what happens to, what happens to most of the avant-garde is that they experience the horror of mechanized killing firsthand in this long, brutal world war. And so the excitement of combat and the lure of the machine lose their glamour very quickly. I think an interesting comparison for us to consider is Boccioni's unique forms of continuity in space with Picasso's synthetic cubist work called The Guitar. They're separated by only about a year, and I think there's some really compelling ways that these works pursue new advances in kind of art materials and abstraction. We haven't talked about Russia. Russia has always had a very kind of complicated relationship with Europe and the West. Is Russia part of Europe? Is it part of Asia? Does it look east? Does it look west? But what happens in the 20th century is that we see Russian artists increasingly come into contact with the European avant-garde. And in the course of their own radical political revolutions, first in 1905 with the establishment of the Duma, a democratic legislative governing body, but then of course later in the communist revolution in Russia, we see how the Russian avant-garde really begins to align themselves with these new political ideologies that come to power in Russia. We're going to start with suprematism, and we're going to look at the work of Kazimir Malevich. And then later in this module, we will look at constructivism, and that is the work of Vladimir Tatlin. Malevich's Black Squares, his suprematist work, starts before the Russian Revolution, but I encourage you to think about how these plain canvases, these simple geometric shapes, how they could be used to advance the ideals of communism and the Russian Revolution. I think first off, you notice in the exhibition in Petrograd that these works have no elaborate frames. That changes their status as art objects. There's no separation of art from the audience's space. There's nothing to mark this work as a commodity, as a consumer product to buy and sell. And there's also one canvas here in the corner that's hung at the top of the wall across the corner. That is significant because that method of hanging something over a corner at the top of your room is typically the spot that's reserved for a Russian Orthodox Christian icon painting. But Malevich has replaced an icon of, say, the Virgin and Child with a plain black square, as if this is the new icon. This is the new religion. Suprematism in this way marks a radical break with the past, like Italian Futurism. And think of that name, suprematism, art that is on a supreme plane, art that is so abstract it enters the realm of pure thought, and the form hovers as if weightless. And I think we can see that really clearly here in Malevich's later canvas, White on White. This is art that hovers on the brink of dematerialization. It's depersonalized. It's collectivism. Anyone could do this. And I think that is precisely how this avant-garde work aligns with the Russian Revolution. It's approachable. Nobody needs an extensive education or a particular cultural background to understand this. And furthermore, an avant-garde radical new government should be represented by an avant-garde radical new art form. This desire to start from ground zero and this complete break with the Western values of capitalism.